Thank you for having me on. Thank you for inviting me to do this talk. Greetings from a very wet and miserable Ireland. The day after St. Patrick's Day is always so depressing, but it's very wet and miserable here tonight. I'm sure there's a lot of people going, is it any other way ever in Ireland? But that's the way we are. I'm going to talk a bit about this tonight. I run a World War One course. We entitled The Great War in my home university, and I was just actually talking about this last week. And it always strikes me that basically when you look at, say, 1916 and the plans that have been made for kind of like a massive kind of like French British offensive on the Western Front, and then that all falls apart due to, of course, the German army taking the initiative at Verdun and putting in their initial attack. So Allied plans fall apart to some degree, and then the British Army ends up taking up the heavy lifting really for the rest of 1916 in terms of the Somme and etc. In many ways, it's a very similar kind of situation in 1917. There are various Allied conferences, and we'll talk about these as we go ahead. But there are plans for 1917, Allied plans, French plans in particular, focusing on Nivelle and his offensive. And when that all falls apart, really, it is up to the British Army to maintain the momentum, if momentum is to be maintained on the Western Front for the rest of 1917. How did I get into this? I have to admit, I got into this process. I was always curious about the Nivelle offensive from the point of view that it was so under discussed in literature about the Western Front. Robert Doughty's Pyrrhic Victory, his history of the French army in World War One, it was probably the best treatment. And in that in mind, I was actually based in Paris for a couple of years on a research project for Trinity College here in Dublin. And it was the focus of that research was the 18th century. It was totally different. But I was based here at the French Military Archives at the Chateau Vincennes on the outskirts of Paris. And I realized this was an opportunity to I had file numbers to actually pull up the files and get into what actually happened in the Nivelle offensive. And I have to admit, I subsequently wrote a book about this, but it was purely for my own curiosity, which is where all the best research actually happens, really, isn't it? It was purely just for me. I got into it. I said, might write an article about it. But then when I got into the operational files, and the files about some of the individuals and the files about the inquiry, I said, no. I said, there's a book in this. So that's where it went. But it was really work I was doing for myself that somebody else was paying for at that time. But that's another story entirely. I don't work for them anymore. When we look, I think it's recognized that when you look at those first 2 years of the war, 2-3 years of the war, the great quote there from Winston Churchill, talking about the sacrifices of the French army. Initially the biggest army on the Allied side in Europe. And then obviously by 1917, they're in the serious issues in terms of numbers. British army is building up. The Americans will eventually pitch in as well. But for those initial years, much of the weight actually kind of rested on French shoulders as we went forward into the war in 14, 15, and then the horror of 1916 as well. And just to give you some numbers, they always they always are staggering, I think, by modern concepts. When we look at modern armies and we talk about defense spending and defense reductions in defense spending, whatever else, the actual the standing army, what was available when the war broke out, and then by calling up reservists, being able to get close to 3 million by the middle of end of August, and then they're getting into, by the end of the war, over 8.3 million have been mobilized. And their losses, French losses, are catastrophic. It's about 1.3 million dead. Okay, that's not counting injured. That's not counting missing. The missing are obviously dead, and they'll factor into the final kind of like equation on this. But when you look at the timeline in that, about 50%, almost 50% of the war dead is by the end of 1915, which reflects the horrendous fighting they went through in the early months of the war in 1914. But although I'm sure we're all aware of those catastrophic repeated offensives, that essentially were gaining them nothing other than massive casualties throughout 1915. But by the end of 1915, they had basically suffered about 50% of their casualties, and that is before Verdun. That is before Nivelle offensive, and already it's an extremely damaged army, really, by that stage. And also, there has to be. I mean, again, we're all aware of how they went to war, both in terms of their physical equipment. The uniforms were Napoleonic, and you will come across German soldiers talking about this, talking about watching them maneuvering in with red trousers, some still wearing red hats. If they're lucky, they've got a cover for their kepi, so it's no longer red as well. Um, and then that army will become, by 1916, 1917, much more practically kind of equipped in terms of its uniform. They'll go from red trousers, red hats to horizon blue, and then from horizon blue into khaki. So trying to disappear into the landscape. Whereas really in 1914, very much caught in a Napoleonic frame of mind. They want their soldiers to stand out and be prideful in their uniform and their appearance, which in a modern battlefield was total lunacy, really. And mustn't forget as well, colonial troops. I mean, they can reach out to not only kind of like North Africans, but also Senegalese. They can reach out across Africa. They can also reach into Indochina. They can get kind of like labor from China itself. So there is a bigger remit to the French army. It's not just metropolitan France. So there's also the colonies, and those people will be factored in all battles, but they will also make an appearance in the Nivelle offensive as well. I always think as well that the battlefield philosophy, and I talk to, as I said, I have modern undergraduates, and then I do some work in terms of military cadets and military education. And I think when you run through uh, kind of the operational doctrine, if you could call it doctrine, of 1914, people just blanch at the very idea. All this whole idea of Colonel Grand Maison and the Grand Masonites. And we all have some idea of this, the whole idea that the offensive à l'outrance will see one through any operational situation. If the soldiers have enough motivation, they will bypass machine gun positions or whatever it is. And obviously that kind of philosophy is hugely due to some of the catastrophic losses in the early part of the war. And even when you look at the French, I mean, the French field regulations, and I have a quote there, and this is late as the 1890s. And this is, when you think of their experiences in the Franco-Prussian War, 1870, 1871, at that stage, they should really be thinking differently. And whatever about being in this place in 1895, but the idea of kind of bugle calls, kind of rushes across open ground towards the enemy, and somehow supporting that with the magazine rifles in your infantry units. The idea of carrying out assaults in the early 20th century, really they should know better. In light of, say, not only Anglo-Boer War, but kind of like the Russo-Japanese War, we've seen what these kind of tactics will deal with or end in, and still they're very much stuck in that kind of space that Elan will see them through. I think as well, when you come to 1916, as I said, there is huge pressure in the French system to shift. General Joffre has emerged in 1914 as the hero of the Marne. And the French have this, they do this repeatedly, and they do this with Joffre, they do it with Nivelle. They create this public hero. And having created this kind of essentially a sacred cow, they can't then slaughter it. Now, Joffre is essentially, he's a solid, he is a calm, he's a safe pair of hands, but he is not operationally, he has no imagination. So we have that continued throughout 1916. When they're not defending Verdun, we've got continued offensives elsewhere, and the body count is becoming catastrophic. So you see within the French system, the French popular opinion, the French press, and increasingly within French politicians, this idea that we need to move this man on as gracefully as we possibly can. And they start looking around in late 1916 uh, for possible options. Also, we have operationally, what is the plan going to be for 1917? Essentially, all plans for the big plan for 1916 was to have basically a combined French-British operation on the Western Front, supported by a considerable lift on the Eastern Front by the Russians at the same time. Those plans have all fallen apart because of the Verdun battle. So we see in November and into December, we see a series of military conferences, and that's a photograph of the mid-November conference just outside Paris. And we can recognize some of those people there. We can see Joffre at the front row. We see General Haig, Douglas Haig is there in the front row. There also, I mean, there are allies there from other nations. There are Italians. We can see some Russians. And the sharp eye amongst you, if you can look at that, the person stood directly behind Joffre is actually Japanese. It's a Japanese liaison officer. Um, and the plan that essentially emerges out of this conference is the whole idea of pretty much the same again, a massive kind of like campaign in the West, supported by a push on the Eastern Front as well. And the idea that at some stage, the losses must have ranked up so much in the German army. This will be the year we'll have victory in 1917. What we also see within in politicians, we see this with Lloyd George on the British side, who's succeeded Asquith as prime minister. Uh, Basically, a push to get greater levels of control over the military. Okay, they're looking at this. The war's running on, catastrophic losses, basically recruits being raised, trained up, going and dying, etc. So there's an effort on politicians to gain more control over the generals, if that makes sense, and particularly so in the French case. Um, there's a considerable amount of kind of like turmoil politically in France. The Viviani government collapses, and we get a new kind of like prime minister. The man on the right is Briand. Briand is the new prime minister. Um, on the French side. Um, and he is basically inheriting a war situation that looks catastrophic. There's increasing unrest at home, and he needs to find somebody with a plan that's going to end all this, hopefully by the summer of 1917. David Lloyd George, we all recognize there on the left, he is very much in the same cycle. Okay, he's very much in the same, I think, level of thinking at that time as well. How to control the military. So that is the French. I mean, the French kind of like the Briand government has goes through almost immediately goes through a series of confidence votes, and it needs to find that successful leader, Joffre. Okay, they are very much aware that they're kind of like the military, the army is low, that you've got exhausted morale, exhausted troops, and also there's a context of there are strikes in France. There are women's strikes. There are industrial strikes. There's leftist agitation, so it's looking all increasingly fragile. And in Briand's mind, he's looking at if his government collapses, will France actually collapse into turmoil and actually fall out of this war? Okay. Um, it's also a very tense time between France and England, or France and Britain. When you see, I think, particularly when you get into some of the censored mail that does survive at that time, French soldiers writing home, and one of they have various gripes about in terms of their leave, in terms of their conditions on the front. They have various kind of gripes, and like all good soldiers, they're always bitching and grumbling. But one of the key things that comes up in the letters again and again and again is that Britain isn't lifting its proper weight. That Britain somehow is standing to one side and allowing Frenchmen to get killed. And it's no, I'm sure people are listening to that and getting incensed already, but that is the consensus, and that is the feeling in the French army. So early December, first half of December, Joffre is gone. Okay, he's promoted to a meaningless position, an inspector type position. He's elevated to be a marshal of France, and he's gone. And General Nivelle replaces him with Lotté as Minister of War. Now, as typically, and people who followed the war on the French side, every time there's a kind of one of these senior appointments up, for grabs. There are usually various candidates in the field, but they are too Catholic or they're too socialist or whatever. Okay, Nivelle, it basically emerges from the herd, head and shoulders above them because of his successes, of his is basically his public persona, and he gets replaced, or he gets to replace Joff, if that makes sense. There's a lot of, I mean, that's the front of Le Petit Journal. There's a lot of kind of like positive press about him, and he makes a statement that he likes to repeat again and again. We have the formula. We have the formula. Okay, and he begins to start talking about a great offensive, and he realizes, I think he has a good idea of the French pulse. So he has a good awareness of where the public is at. Um, and he makes the promise that this will be within 48 hours, that he's going to launch something that essentially is going to end the war on the Western Front in 2 days. Okay. So who is Robert Nivelle? As you can see, born 1856. He is kind of, his mother is English, so he speaks fluent English, which is seen as a plus as well. This is after all alliance warfare. It's seen he at least he can speak English. I don't know if he's very culturally aware. I don't know if he gets certain aspects of the British mindset, and we can see that going forward. His grandfather was a Waterloo veteran. Captain Robert Sparrow was a Waterloo veteran. And to be honest, as the war breaks out, he is of an age, he is heading towards retirement. It is essentially over for him in 1914, apart from the fact that the war breaks out and all of a sudden he's in the midst of it. And he immediately gets public attention. At the Battle of the Marne in September of 1914, he's an artilleryman. Okay, he's an artilleryman. He leads his regiment through retreating infantry, unlimbers the guns, takes on a German division, basically point blank, shooting over open sights, etc. He's in charge of a regiment of 75, French 75. This was on canals. And that immediately gets him some public attention. So what we see, he starts going up the ranks quickly. Kind of by the middle of 1916, he has a general rank. He is a major general. In Verdun, he's extremely prominent as well. In the later phases of that battle, he's one of the few French commanders who can actually successfully do something, and also usually with a minimum of casualties. By World War One standards, now I mean, by World War One standards, he could keep his casualties low. The flip side of that man, he is charming. He is unctuously charming, particularly to politicians, particularly to the press. He's extremely opinionated. He will walk into an Allied conference. He would get into a meeting with Douglas Haig and basically start telling him his job. Okay, and immediately that ruffles people's fur. But he also is very politically aware, and he realizes that at this moment in time, he is the big dog in the French army. As I said, hero of Verdun. Interestingly, it's Fort Douaumont that basically it becomes a key location. Strategically, it's worth is questionable, but in terms of kind of like French iconography of the location, it's a place that has to be taken back, and he succeeds in taking that back in late 1916 using various methods. So that is what really propels him into the public eye. Also, the French, the French, they shall not pass. That is him. Quite often we think that's Pétain. That's not. It's actually Nivelle coins that phrase and gets it into the newspapers. So what are his methods? Okay, we see these in kind of we see this in the Verdun battles, and he basically is going to take these methods and expand them to the power of 100. Really, essentially, I mean, he's somebody who's probably an excellent divisional commander, but Peter Principle here, he's just been promoted beyond his capacities. Okay. Now, he trains his people very well. He rehearses them very well, using maps and using kind of also kind of like modeling German fortifications in the field. So he does that rehearsal very, very good. In terms of how he uses his artillery, he does creeping barrages. He is very, very careful in organizing counter battery fire. But the significant thing at Verdun that he says he's going to do again is this idea of the fire corridor. And essentially, what he's going to do is concentrate artillery fire along a very narrow front that will then progress into the German lines. And the whole idea that his troops can get in behind that and move along behind it. So it's like a creeping barrage, excuse me, but it's focused over a very, very narrow area. Okay. So it's the idea of cutting through with a knife. Okay. And you will follow up. The infantry will follow that corridor of fire. That's the idea. It's worked at Duomo. So why can't it work elsewhere? That's his logic. His logic about this. He also upguns his infantry, like more and more light machine guns, more grenades, more grenade launchers, grenade throwers, and the French like the flamethrowers, more flamethrowers, trying to develop a smaller model that can advance forward as well. And the whole idea that when you put all that together, you have the clever use of the artillery, you concentrate force behind that, and you drive a rather dramatic wedge into the German lines. Now, it's not something, as I said, it's not something he's plucked just from the air. It's something that he has tried and succeeded with. But he now thinks he can do that on a multiple army basis. Okay. Now, in terms of the staff work, in terms of keeping in his head what he needs to keep in his head, as the months go forward into the preparation for this, we see that is beyond him. Okay, that is beyond him. Okay. Also, in terms of, he's one of these leaders who is reading his own press, okay, and believing his own press. Any aspect of self-doubt in himself seems to disappear by March of 1917. There is no level of doubt. And I think some level of doubt, self-doubt, is the mark of a good commander, really. You have to question your own stuff. There's also other people who are associated with him. General Mangan, the butcher. He's a man who usually commands colonial troops, Senegalese, North Africans, Moroccans, notoriously casual about his casualty lists. So, you've got people like this who are not going to question the plan, because at the end of the day, they don't really care about how many people get killed. I mean, Mangan famously came out towards the end of the war, and he made the statement like, no matter what you do, he said, a lot of people get killed. And I suppose there's a certain logic there, brutal logic. And Colonel Allenson, who's his chief of staff, we also recognize now was driving a lot of the plans, and also interposing himself in some of the conversations between Nivelle and Haig. Okay, I'll talk about the correspondence in a minute. But Alençon is terminally ill; he's dying, and he wants to see a French success before he goes. Okay, so there are dark kind of like personal motives here as well. So what's he doing? I mean, it's basically he looks to the kind of like the Western Front, and he wants a decisive battle. Now, by that I mean in a Napoleonic way. Okay, I'm actually going to skip all the way to the end here. What's the objective? The objective is not territory, and the objective is not breakout in itself. What he wants to do is grab hold of the German field armies and destroy them. Okay, what he wants is an Austerlitz kind of moment. He wants that where and his logic is you can't deny his logic. It's perfectly sound. If I destroy the German field armies, this war is over. Okay. But saying that in a sentence and achieving that in the battlefield are two entirely different things. So the bigger plan is there's going to be that BEF attack up around Arras. There's going to be the kind of the attack in on Vimy. Okay. They are diversionary efforts. And then he's going to gather 4 French army groups. He wants the BEF to do the diversionary efforts. He doesn't want them to be part of the big party, because he wants this to be France winning the war. Okay. He wants France to win the war here. So 4 army groups, about over a million, probably about 1.2. And he starts talking kind of the language of blitzkrieg, really: tempo, violence, brutality, speed, and success in 48 hours. He keeps coming back to this, and promising that if he hasn't got success in 48 hours, he would shut the whole thing down. Okay. So that is it. And the objective, as I said, the German army. And he kind of like, he sends out his general orders, and you can see, that's a direct quote from them, basically trying to psych up his troops to what the objective is. And in many ways, this is kind of it's on the fringes of kind of mission orientated orders, but the whole idea is to destroy the enemy army. Okay, not a geographic objective, but basically to destroy the German army. As I said, it's a perfectly logical thing to want, but getting it is something else. Now, a map, can't beat these maps. These are the West Point maps. If you look kind of these boxed areas there, look at those boxed areas. Can I get this? Yes, I can. Okay, so this obviously BF. Okay, so we all know this Vimy, harass, a considerable effort there. That's going to be over. That's going to be in excess of 100,000 BEF casualties. And I'm sure most people in the room know the story of those actions. That's BEF attacked Vimy and in around Arras, Vimy Ridge, Canadians, Anzac forces, but that's and also Anzac force. That is a major effort for the BEF, but he sees that as a diversion. They've chosen this part of the line. He's chosen this part of the line precisely because of this angle here for the main French effort. The idea being that if you burst through here, you have the opportunity to basically roll north, roll south, and scoop up these German armies and defeat them in the field. He imagines a Tannenberg kind of operation where you'll have some open ground, you'll grab hold of kind of German army under Ruprecht, or you'll grab it under Crown Prince Wilhelm and you'll destroy it. Okay, and that would be the main effort. Again, this looks exceptionally good on this map, but how does it play out? I think this aspect, and I actually have, there's a specific file in queue of the correspondence between Nivelle and Haig. And if I ever get time, I will try and write an article about it because it's a very revealing kind of it's a very revealing conference. These people, the two of them go head to head on various different counts in terms of kind of British responsibilities and taking more and more of the line, in terms of the use of railway rolling stock, because they're both trying to maneuver their armies around. There's a limited French level of French rolling stock on the railways, and they're fighting over that. There's a significant conference in Calais in kind of like in February of 1917. It becomes very immediate to Haig, though, that Lloyd George is maneuvering around him, excuse me, wanting to get Haig removed, and showing dubious levels of loyalty. Lloyd George is discussing with the French government and discussing also with Nivelle about Haig's competence and is he fit to kind of like command the British Army, and should the British Army have another commander, and should perhaps the British Army be subordinated to the French Army. So the atmosphere is toxic, is absolutely toxic, and like we're used to this idea, alliance warfare is difficult, and we're used to people butting heads against each other. But the idea of the British Prime Minister actually getting involved in these conversations is rather incredible. But that's the manoeuvring that's going around. As I said, you have these. This is one of the files. I have this copied. I'd like to do. I mean, I've used it in the book. I'd like to come back and do something more on it. But it's an exercise, I think, in understatement and differing levels of courtesy. Some of Nivelle's communications to Haig are quite peremptory, okay, quite arrogant. And now we also question, was he actually writing these? Was it him or was it Allenson, the other character as chief of staff? It would seem he's responsible for some of these, but they're not exceptionally courteous in terms of the exchanges. Haig is always absolutely, the way if they go low, you rip the bar. Haig is always tremendously courteous in all his responses, but less so Nivelle. So a couple of things about this. I mean, in many ways, this is an interesting plan as well. I mean, the Nivelle plan is interesting. The French have two tank programs. Okay, two tank programs running side by side each other. This is very French, isn't it? Running side by side each other, different committees. Putting huge resources on rather limited kind of like industrial capacity, but they have two running side by side. And one is the Schneider program, which produces this. In terms of, I think there's probably many tank buffs, World War I tank buffs among you, but we all know the story here. It is under armored. It has to have an up armoring, a surblonde, has to have upper armoring on this. The positioning of the main gun is dubious. Like there in the kind of, you could see it there in the middle of the picture. Some of the early versions have the petrol tank up the front. So there's various issues with this, but also in terms of its trench crossing ability is reasonably poor. But what the French are doing, they've developed these, and they've also developed this, the Chamon, the Saint Chamon, which again is a problematic design. You've got a huge superstructure there on quite a small track chassis. They have a tendency to nose in, to dig into trenches and not get out. But I think the clever thing about the French plan is that they're not going to use them in dribs and drabs. The first attack they're going to do is 120 plus 130 tanks. It is the first massed tank attack that we see from the French army. Not 20, not 30, over 100. And also kind of in terms of getting this technology, using this kind of technology to start moving your tanks around. As we all know, these things are notoriously unreliable in terms of their mechanical abilities. So you don't actually get them to drive up to the front. You shunt them around on lorries, and you can move them laterally along the inside of the front much, much quicker. So there are clever things in Niville's plan. And also he's using more and more motorized lorries like this to move his artillery around. So there are clever things about it. But as I said, kind of, you've got that political command relationship that's difficult. You've got the relationship with Haig has become difficult. Then you also see dissent amongst the French, in particular General Pétain and also Michelet. They formally protest that this offensive actually going forward. There's various different reasons for this. They don't believe in the plan. They don't believe that it can be launched in the terrain that he wants to launch it in. But also they're very, very aware that his operational security is catastrophic. There was a joke at the time that every waiter in Paris knew the plan, because he would show, and there's witnesses to this, they would talk about it. He would show up at a dinner party, he would start expounding, he'd start drawing on the tablecloth what he's going to do. Everyone knew about this plan. Okay. That the press, obviously, politicians, but also the general public. That's the terrain. And I'm sure there's some ex-military people listening tonight. You can see that's a difficult terrain. That's a postcard of the time. And that's a difficult terrain to work into. Okay. Essentially, advancing from the kind of like the start line, troops had to cross a river, a canal, and then fight uphill into the Chemin des Dames, which is this kind of country. Extremely difficult. Impossible for tanks. Possible for tanks to penetrate in there. But that is the terrain, and he doesn't seem to have really done an appreciation of how this would impact on the plan. Well, I also have to factor in this as well. I mean, again, the Allies are planning something, and the Germans take the initiative. That the operation to move back to the Hindenburg line that we see developing in February, March 1917 really undercuts. I mean, initially that shaded area is part of the area that's they recede back out of. That was initially one of the main areas that Nivelle was planning to go into. He was planning to kind of like attack into that area. Now you have that situation where they're going to follow up and get back into contact with the German army by the middle of March. So they're kind of being gazumped here in terms of this. And then the worrying thing as well, that the Germans are getting into this defense in depth, kind of like the lightly held front line, the blockhouse positions, and then when you advance in 5, 6, 7 kilometers into that, you meet the fresh reserve units who are waiting to counterattack, who are waiting essentially to kill you. So that kind of defense in depth is worrying. And more and more of these, and French troops at the time talk about attacking into it, finding them positioned to firing to their backs, etc., etc. This one is around Ypres, but I'm sure we've seen these at least in books, if not in the ground. These are dotted throughout the area that Nivelle is going to fight into, without really any knowledge of what's there. When you look at, I think Pétain actually kind of like sums this up in early 1917, and he's a man with definitely his finger on the pulse, and he looks at the French army and he's touring and he's talking to people, and he says one more is what they have left in the tank, and it has to be successful, that they cannot endure another failure. Okay. And he knows it, but Nivelle does not seem to do it. We start seeing things like this. This is actually from, sure, people recognize this. This is a Charlie's War. I'm sure we've all read Charlie's War, but that's from an episode of Charlie's War. But that idea is based on the reality. Troops moving up to the line, kind of like buying because they've no faith in their generals. They're about to be slaughtered like sheep. That starts to begin even before the deadline for this is set to mid-April, even before that. So that's the way we've seen this map, so we can move on. That's the slightly modified plan. You can see that slightly modified plan, this other effort here now that Pétain has kind of split up this effort on the bend, but Pétain is going to push in here. But essentially the same plan. So other things have to fly into the geopolitical context. February, March, we've got problems with Russia. Okay, Russia is beginning to fall out of this war. Okay, you've got difficulties on the Italian front. It is, under German pressure, Austrian pressure. It's in a kind of difficult position. And then the Briand government falls, okay, and it's replaced by Ribot-Painlevé. Essentially, when you're running up, there's a crucial meeting on the 6th of April, and various people are in this room. And the only person really in that room that believes in this offensive anymore is Nivelle. Okay. Pétain wants it stopped. Michelin wants it stopped. The politicians Ribot and Painlevé have not got the moral gumption to make a decision and call it off. So they press ahead, and at the backdrop of all of this, there's the idea of US support coming into the war. That's a plus. It's a plus for everyone. It's a plus for France. But also there's a niggle here, there's a niggling kind of like thing amongst the French, that they want to win this war before the Americans arrive in theatre. The French want to win this themselves. Okay, so really it's as I say, the Frankenstein's monster character here. The politicians recognize this. They're getting representations from the subordinate generals to call it off. They have bigged Nivelle up so much. They cannot stand down now and say, look, this guy actually, he's not going to do it, and we're removing him. They actually don't have the courage to do that. So the whole thing it's postponed, and then it goes forward again. And as I said earlier on, Operation Security is pretty poor, but the Germans actually gets captured. A sergeant gets captured in the evening of the 4th and 5th of April with a full set of the plans. And by a full set of the plans, I mean kind of not only the maps and etc., but the timings for the artillery barrages, directions of the artillery barrages, so the Germans now have the entire plan. And they will confront this with 43 divisions. Other factors that come in, other problems, it's probably that winter of 16-17 is particularly bleak, particularly awful. But it also kind of like goes through into the early, what should be spring. And when you've already got you still have sub-zero temperatures in April, and you will actually have atrocious weather when all this starts off. There's problems with the barrage in terms of feeding it. And then there's also problems with the German artillery in that it has not all been identified and destroyed, which is something that we've heard so many times in these kind of offensives, but it hasn't been destroyed. Air power, it plays a significant role in this, and on occasionally the French have control of the air, but more often than not they haven't. So they cannot see into the German lines. They cannot see what's going on there. So for the people on the ground, they're going to be operating blind, really. When this gets going, I would say it all wraps up pretty quick, ultimately, at the end of the day. The main assault starts off 16th and 17th. You have those preliminaries from both the French army and the British army in around Arras. 16th, 17th, we got the main effort of the French. The weather is sleet and snow. We have difficulties getting across the river, difficulties getting across the canal. The tanks kind of like bunch up, get taken out. And then when the soldiers that do get beyond the river, beyond the canal, are then fighting uphill into the Chemin des Dames, into a very well-prepared German position, and it all starts coming across, falling apart. Usual problems with the tanks, like the serious number of breakdowns, but also 52 destroyed. That's almost almost 50% of your tank force taken out by combinations. German artillery has a field day, literally. There's one position where they're waiting to cross the canal and they back up in a line. And I think it's one team on a 77 take out three or four of them. So those kind of issues. Your tanks, you're hoping to be significant and not going to be significant. Difficulties getting a lot of passing troops through, getting to the proper place of deployment. There's huge delays. People aren't in the right place for 0 hour. And then once they get through, they feel the German defense difficulties getting up ammunition, exhaustion increasingly by 48 hours. The troops exhausted, and they have prepared in that very. I'm not. I won't say a French way, but they've done this before. But they've underprepared their medical services. They have preparation for maybe 10% of the casualties they have, so the medical services actually collapse. You come across these kind of like quotes in the reports at the time, and they really that's a reasonably moderate one, Second Colonial Corps, but it is a catalogue of misery really for the infantry, like the machine guns, wires not cut, reserves are intact, and it's an infantryman's nightmare. It's just an infantryman's nightmare. And crucially, again, as usual, the bombardment hasn't been effective. There's some really heartbreaking stuff. I mean, I came across reports and it was a chasseur unit, and he's reporting watching his people running up and down outside, running kind of laterally up and down outside unbroken barbed wire emplacements, can't get through and getting picked off outside and heaping up the bodies. It's absolutely catastrophic. When you look, I don't know if you can see this map here very well, it's a bit pale, but the usual kind of, as one would expect almost in the Western Front, the hatched line at the top is your maximum kind of like penetration. At one place, the depth, the maximum depth is about just short of 20k, just short of 20k. But in other places, you can measure it by a couple of 100 meters. And the kind of the cost, it's about 130,000, over 130,000. Most of those are in the first 48 hours. 48 hours. It's catastrophic levels of dead, wounded, and POWs. So what happens? What happens after this? Basically, Nivelle wants to keep on trying, having repeatedly kind of promised 48 hours. So it kicks off 0 hours on the 16th. So 16th, 17th, and 48 hours later, it hasn't achieved results. The 20th, he announces he wants to keep on pushing. They allow him kind of like actually to do that for another few days. And Nivelle actually kind of like there's a meeting and he actually shuts it down. And he will keep on doing kind of small diversionary actions into May, but that's it. It is over. And then on the other side, it gets all very unseemly on the far side, which they're pressing Nivelle to go. And essentially, they appoint his successor. Pétain is appointed 29th of April. And Nivelle resigns on 15th of May as CNC. But he still hangs around his office for another 3 or 4 days. Keeps showing up for work. It's just incredible. And there are accounts of this, like there's a couple of accounts of officers in French headquarters, and like people standing at the door shouting at him, essentially trying to get him to get out of the office and go, please go away. I looked at the casualty lists on this, and to use that kind of like that phrase, gerrymandering, you can see overwritings. There was an effort not to include colonial troops in the body count. There's a Russian brigade assigned to this as well. There's an effort not to count them in. If somebody is wounded and goes back to his unit within a certain amount of time, they try not to include them in the wounded figures, but it is well over 100,000 at the end of the day. But you can see them if you pull the file. You can see where people have been like writing notes not to include this and not to mention this and take this out. Okay, and then there's a fascinating inquiry, and again the file. Basically, every general who shows up to give testimony who says the same thing. Says, like, this was the plan. I had doubts about the plan. I expressed my doubts, but went ahead, was told to go ahead anyway, and I obeyed my orders. It's a subtle variation on the Nuremberg defense. And when that stops, when that music stops playing, everybody else has tried to exonerate themselves, and Nivelle is left very much swinging in the wind. Um, Obviously, we know on the far side of this as well. I won't go into this hugely here because I suppose we're coming up on time. But the French army is essentially broken. It's essentially broken. And it's probably the biggest German intelligence failure when you think of it of the war. They do not realize that the French army is in such a poor position opposite them. This would have been the moment to actually do something about this. But there's been a certain amount of scholarship about this. We reckon that about kind of like 67 divisions are affected, which works out at about somewhere between 40 and 50% of the entire French army. Um, the behavior ranges from basically guys refusing to go to the front line, but like a strike, like kind of operation. No, I'm not going up. And based on the security in numbers, you can't basically court martial and shoot all of us. We are not going up. The whole battalion, the whole regiment, the whole division, we're not going up. Okay, so there's that kind of behavior. There's other more righteous behavior where they take over towns, where officers have to lock themselves in buildings and defend themselves. On one occasion, a group of them get a train and they want to go to Paris. So there's various levels of behavior in this, but the ultimate thing is that it looks like it's sitting down. And it's coming at a particularly bad time. There are strikes back home. Particularly, there's a lot of agitation by women over labour stuff, but also a kind of a bring our husbands home kind of movement as well. So that's happening. There's a carrot and stick approach in this. Pétain is appointed to basically save the French army in this occasion. There is draconian stuff. There are court martials. There are death sentences. 27 are executed, and by that I mean are officially recorded, having gone through the process and been executed. We know there are more summary executions. Pétain as well. I mean, every French soldier who's sentenced to death has the right of appeal. Okay, all the way to the French president, he can appeal that. He is a French citizen first and foremost. Okay, and Pétain admits that he doesn't forward all the appeals to the president. Okay, so we know it's more than 27 people executed. And Pétain and Haig meet. There's a significant meeting in May where they basically did, introduced themselves to each other, etc., etc. It's obvious now that Pétain does not tell Haig the full extent of the story. Haig will become more and more aware of it, but not from the point of view that he's been told officially by his French counterpart. Okay, he doesn't tell him. So there's various kind of like reforms in terms of leave, living conditions, the kind of like time in the front line. And Pétain will go around the French army, basically showing up at units, standing on the bonnet of the car, like Monty in World War II, talking to the troops and making the promise, no more offensive actions. Okay, we're in a defensive posture until the Americans arrive. Okay, that is basically the tenor of what he tells people, and it calms the whole situation down. And by the end of 1917, they will be fit for some limited offensive action in connection with, say, Tour Deep or later on in the war. I'm not huge into counterfactuals because I always think that they're the last refuge of the historical charlatan, really, aren't they? But the what if scenario here, you've got Russia will have Red October. Russia is moving towards being out of the war by the end of 1917. Italy is looking very bad. What if France was out as well? What if France had collapsed utterly? And you see that reflected in some of Haig's writings at the time, some of his journals, some of his letters. He reaches that moment and he says, will we have to realign in Belgium? Is it now? Will it just be us holding out for France? A final couple of words. Nivelle after the war, basically gets he does, because he can speak English. He does a kind of like a morale boosting tour of America and a fundraising tour of America towards the end of the war. But really, he's marginalized to North African commands thereafter. When they have the big victory, kind of like commemoration in Paris in 1919, they have the year after the ceasefire. He's not invited. Everybody else is invited. Everyone has been rehabilitated. Mangan has been rehabilitated. Joffre is rehabilitated, but not Nivelle. He is in the wilderness. Some people make this kind of like argument when you look at the numbers, 28,000 Germans plus taking POW, saved amount of field guns, etc., etc. I think, is that a success? It looks more successful than some things we'd seen around that period. I think if that was happening in 1915, people would be very happy with that. But in the context of an almost broken army in 1917, that are expecting the promises will be made good and they're going to win this war by the summer and I'll be out of it. It is a failure too far at this point in time, and everything just falls apart. Interesting, I think the Germans spot this. This is actually quoted in Heinz Guderian's Achtung Panzer, but they look at the French attack and they come up with this. I find this a fascinating little quote. Basically the tanks, etc. They're interesting. There's offensive. There's a force of offensive there. It's interesting, and if you develop other things to keep up with them, we could have something there. But you're thinking something's happened. What does it mean? And they're not actually thinking. The German report isn't thinking about the next 6 months or the next, kind of the next 12 months. It's really looking forward to the next 5 to 10 years. That's what it's thinking. In the midst of a war, it's a fascinating report, but it's just, I find it very, very interesting. Kind of a popular reference, I suppose, we've all seen Paths of Glory. I'm sure most of us have. If we haven't, you must watch it. You must watch it. Stanley Kubrick's great World War I epic. When you look at it, there's various arguments about what operation that actually is modeled on. I think when you look at the overweening kind of like general in command, when you look at the failure, when you look at the court-martials, all I will say is it looks very, very similar to the Nivelle offensive to me, or aspects of the Nivelle offensive. So I think there might be something in that. Okay, I think I will stop here. I will just say that kind of, it's a classic case where you have somebody who emerges from a success, and Lloyd George even spotted this, in kind of like December of 16, early 17. He seemed like a very safe pair of hands. This man was a good bet, and then by the time it all kicks off in April, he's become a crazy plunger. Basically, he is doubling down. He is trying to get people to believe in something. He is underprepared, but he cannot step away from this and say, express any doubt in his own plan. And the plan ultimately almost breaks the French army. Okay, I think I'll leave it at that, and we can go to questions or whatever we do.
Thank you so much. We're just in a moment going to be joined by Gordon Holmes, and Gordon Holmes has a question for you.
There's a lot of questions to ask, isn't there, about this lot? I have sent a question in. Was the failure of the French artillery to fully penetrate the German lines and added to the weather conditions a major contributory factor to the failure of the French to overcome the Germans? Or were they not up to it to start with?
I think both. I'd actually answer both there. I mean, one of the things that always disappoints me most about Nivelle, that he is an artilleryman, okay? And the artillery, he's massed these 7,000 guns, which is a reasonably good kind of like artillery park to operate from. And then it fails to do the job. The creeping barrage gets away from the troops. It doesn't break up the wire. It doesn't do the counter battery correctly. It doesn't take out the MGs, doesn't take out the German artillery. It doesn't have the reach to take out the German reserves. So I think there's major issues with the artillery plan. But to be honest, I think that even if you got it right, the German preparation, their defenses are so incredible at this time. They may have succeeded in pushing a bit further into the line, but the idea of catching the German army out and destroying it, absolutely, it's absolute nonsense. It wasn't going to happen.
No. They were the bit off more than they could chew, I think, really, at that point. Was that all this had taken place a major contributory factor to the mutiny of the French army subsequently?
Oh, absolutely. I think it breaks them. It absolutely breaks them. That they come through that. The Verdun is a 300-day battle. They go through that cycle. They get massive casualties in that. In around 500,000. So by the end of kind of like 16, it's a very damaged army. And as Pétain was a man with his finger on the pulse. He reckoned they could do one more lift, and when they do that one more lift, there has to be success. This can't be failure.
They've got to do it.
Got to do it this time, and then it doesn't happen, and they're screwed. I think from the British perspective as well, this has huge ramifications, because now you have a situation where French army's broken. So that is why Messine's offensive, toward Passchendaele, all those battles basically have to be fought to keep the German pressure down throughout that year. So the heavy lifting moves yet again to the BEF.
The French had a lot of problems or discontent with the efforts of the British army. Was that justified, or was it just sour grapes because they seemed to think that we didn't do much for them?
I think they want the British army to build up bigger. They wanted to take on more of the line. They wanted to do more offensive action. I don't think they give they don't look at this and say, look, this is an army that's fielded a relatively small force in 1914, and it's going through a massive expansion, has to get the equipment. I don't think they give the British the benefit of the doubt.
No, that's my opinion as well.
Yeah. And there's a certain level of French arrogance. And I lived there for 2 years. I loved them. I loved their food.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Lovely people. But there is a certain
nice
level.
Wine.
We produced Napoleon. You didn't. There's a bit of that going on.
Yeah, but they've never won a war, have they? Really? So, right. Thank you, David. That was excellent presentation. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and I've overstayed my welcome, I think, Luke. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much for your answers.
No problem. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Hi, Craig.
Hi. Yeah, sorry. Shall I just go ahead and ask my question?
Yeah, please do.
Yeah, thank you. So it's sort of just related to the point that I think was one of the points that was just discussed, which is that, given that I think as Professor Murphy has just said, that after this offensive, the French army ceased to be capable of offensive operations. And then obviously, in the summer of 1917, a couple of months later, Haig decides to launch the Battle of Passchendaele after Messines. Was that even more reckless and foolhardy a decision than is widely considered to be, given that the French army, by the sounds of things, would be incapable of any supporting operations of the BEF?
Yeah, Tory Passchendaele is the controversy that's never going to go away, really, is it? In the context of the time, Messines has been, to a certain extent, has been a success. If you put us at about 20,000 casualties, and that's a success by 1917 standards. And the idea of building on that, and the idea that the Germans might actually be, that constant refrain that we see all commanders doing, that the Germans are about to crack, so we can't push them again. We give them another push. So I think that's feeding into that on top of the Messines success. But to be honest, the idea that there will be some supporting action further south along the line, but there's going to be no major lifting from the French. It's all you. It's all you. So, what do we think of Haig's generalship, Haig's field marshalship? I honestly don't know. Sometimes I think when you read his journals and you read his letters, you say, yeah, actually, in the context of that moment, that probably does make sense. But when you stand back, particularly from Passchendaele, that just looks like a lunatic action from start to finish.
Yeah, and certainly, I guess once after the initial failures and once the weather had set in, and it was just going to be a bloody slog.
Yeah.
The decision to continue with it was just incomprehensible.
I think the terrain always, and there was one of the staff officers who I did a bit of research on, Lawrence Kiggle. It's obvious from his reaction to seeing the terrain that he hadn't actually even looked at it in the pre-action planning. He hadn't motored up and seen what he was going to try and send infantry and tanks as well across in some places. I don't know, the mind boggles, Craig. I have no answers on that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you. Thanks, Craig. And, so Patrick Crozier asked, bear with me. I've been told that there are all sorts of stuff kept secret for 100 years. So has anything emerged since 2017?
Yeah, yes and no. There was initial the court martial material was all put away, and a historian got very limited access to that in the mid-60s, a French historian, and wrote a couple of books around this, the mutineers of 1917. But he was only given very limited access, and the promise was that those files would become more available, more fully on the centenary, and some of them were, and I would say some of them have not been. There's certain there's certain items that we know are missing, okay, and they have not been released. Also, what else in that? Some of the casualty stuff hasn't been released from this either. It was in a limited way after 50 years, and some more material was available in 2017, but not everything. Not everything. So there is material still there that I don't think will be released in my lifetime. I'm not sure if it will be. There's some huge sensitivities about this, and you would think at this stage on there would be full disclosure, but no, there's still material that we haven't seen.
Okay, great, thank you.
Was that gentleman one of the croziers of County Down? Is
he? He may message you. Let us know in the Q&A if you are. Cathal Smith has just joined us. Cathal, would you like to ask your question?
How are you, David?
I'm not bad. You could have waited until tomorrow to ask me this question, Cathal.
I could have, but I'm just too excited.
There's no bonus points for asking this question now. One.
Oh, sure. Quick question, David. Did anything during the French mutiny there, and that the military procedure wasn't followed, like where some of the soldiers that were appealing to the president, and the appeal wasn't sent there, the correct military procedure wasn't followed. Did anything ever become of that? Was he ever evicted or
No,
with anything for? He was just let be.
No, I mean, and this comes back to a certain extent to what the previous gentleman was asking. I mean, there's a set of files in this that purports to be the court martials, the appeals. It's a selection of files, and it purports to be the full story. But then we have comments from people like Petain and whatever else about other cases and different behaviours, but which makes us know that it's not the full story. But so there's material that we haven't seen, but there's no kind of like there's no backlash to him about any of this. I mean, he only admits this years later, and this is the same Marshal Pétain who will have issues with Vichy and have a problematic end of life cycle. So it's he was going to be, there was possibility of being put against the wall and shot, but not for anything he'd done in World War One. Not for anything he'd done in World War One. But it's there's stuff there that it goes outside the normal procedures. We have witnesses to this. We know there's particular cases where field gendarmerie come across mutineers, sort out the ringleaders, and it's an execution at the side of the road. It's a roadside execution. And that doesn't appear in any of the official documentation. It only appears in witness statements.
Thank you.
Great. So a couple here from Tom Conway. Tom asks, beyond your own text on the topic, what other texts would you recommend reading?
I recommend there's an American scholar called Robert Doughty, who wrote a history of the French army in World War One. Excuse me, and it's called Pyrrhic Victory. Pyrrhic Victory, and he devotes maybe 2, maybe 3 chapters to this. And I think that's a very good account, and like that it's based on a deep dive into the archives at the time. He's very, very good. Yeah.
Fantastic, thank you. And also just heard back from Patrick Crozier, who said he's one of the Croziers of Northumberland.
Northumberland Crozier. Okay, very good. Okay.
So Christopher Watts has just joined us to ask a question. Christopher.
Yeah, good evening. Can you hear me?
Perfectly.
Indeed, yes.
Okay. in 1914, recent military history would basically be, I suppose, the American Civil War and the Russo-Japanese War. And I wondered if you could speculate to what degree the lessons of those two wars dictated military strategy in 1914, because I think the essential lesson from both those wars is, or was, that massed infantry attacks against heavily fortified positions could succeed, provided the infantry was prepared to be sufficiently suicidal.
Yep, that was one of the lessons, and that's one of the that is the lesson that they decided to dwell on. I mean, you've got American Civil War, Franco-Prussian War. You've got the South African experience, which shows you, kind of 1899, 1902, the dangers of bringing massed infantry close to people with modern weapons. You've got the Balkan Wars. Russo-Japanese War, I think, is a huge one of this. And like that, you see this situation where, on some occasions, there are mass infantry attacks, like particularly Japanese ones, into Russian positions, heavy casualties, and it's a failure. But then there are also occasions where they do that, there's heavy casualties, and they succeed. And that is the space that people go into. That's the space people go into. I mean, one of the interesting comments, and I'm sure people are aware of this, Ian Hamilton, who commands in Gallipoli, had been the senior British observer for the Russo-Japanese War, and he's written about this, an officer's sketchbook. He's written about this, and he makes this point. He makes this thing, that the Japanese watched the Japanese army do this, and they put in a thing in a prepared position that might be entrenched behind barbed wire, and they get in, they succeed, but it's massive casualties. And he makes, like you would say this, you can't succeed if you're willing to absorb those casualties. There's a certain amount of that mindset on the French side that, we will have success. We might lose 100,000, we might lose 200,000. The thing about it is, nobody imagines that it's going to go on like that for 3 or 4 or 5 years. They're willing to take that hit, the 200,000, the 500,000, with the idea of the war over in a year or 18 months. But then they're in a cycle where it's just going on and on and on, and they keep absorbing those casualties. But I think, Christopher, you're dead right. There's a whole lot of lessons, and they approach these. I mean, military theorists essentially approach these as like it's a buffet, and they take off the bits they want. We've all done this at a buffet. You take off the bits you want and you leave the rest, and that is a lesson they take. It can succeed, and will take the hit. The person who actually, Ivan S. Block, who writes about kind of like future war, he's a futurist, the 1890s. He's dead by the time World War I comes, and he predicts it very, very precisely what's going to happen. And he's a civilian, he's a total civilian, but he notices that this is the tendency, and whether you get into the enemy positions or you don't, you're going to lose a lot of people.
Thank you. Very interesting talk. Thanks for.
Thank you.
Okay, so Peter Noonan should be just rejoining us in a moment. We've just got a few minutes more left for questions. Peter, hello.
David, 2 quick questions, if I may, hopefully quick anyway. To what extent, if any, was the choice of the Chemin des Dames as the area of attack reliant in any way on that area's place in France's history and tradition?
Oh, that's an interesting one. I mean, it has that resonance. And actually, can I go forward a slide here? No, I can't go forward this slide. There's actually, if you go up there now, there's a new memorial. There was a memorial there to Napoleon, where he fights some of his last battles of 1814 there, in that action before kind of like to get into Paris in around Crillon. And there was a Napoleon statue there that was demolished by the Germans, and it's been demolished twice. I think it's demolished in World War I and demolished in World War II. It's been replaced by the modern statue has kind of like a Napoleonic soldier and a World War I French soldier holding up a French flag. So yes, there's a logic in that bend in the line, but that idea of getting into the Chemin des Dames and getting it back and everything that holds in the French psyche is a driver in this too. Yeah, it's a driver in this.
Thank you. The other quick one, again, hopefully quick. I mean, I've heard, and I dare say others have heard about the French or so-called mutinous units being shelled into submission. Is that actually accurate? Is that true?
Yeah, yes and no. there is a case, and it's actually it's not a French unit. It's that Russian brigade that's been put into the French army.
Right.
That starts going looking very, very red. Starts put kind of like start going a bit kind of radical. It's taken to a location away from the front line, and is in a mutinous state, and they eventually will bring up artillery to subdue the Russian unit. So they're French troops shelling a French military camp in France, well behind the lines, to subdue Russians. There is other gunfire and whatever else against French mutineers, but the artillery is used on the Russians. Yeah,
just in that one instance, then.
Yeah, that's the only one I'm aware of where they use shell fire.
Right. Well, that's fascinating. I mean, I'd always heard that it was a widespread sort of tactic, if you like, to subdue the mutinies across the board. But no, I mean that's really useful to know. Thank you.
No problem.
Thank you. Okay, and just while we're waiting, hopefully have another question joining us soon. John Matthew Forth asks, please can you ask, so what percentage of French troops were colonials in this offensive?
Oh, you're talking about about 20%.
Right.
About 20% of the army, yeah. So if you look at that, he's got together about 1.2 million for this in various layers. So that's there must be about 200,000 French colonials in this, Senegalese and North Africans. Yeah, about 20%.
Fantastic, thank you. And David Livermore, I think, has joined us. Hi, David.
Yes, hi, thanks. A very interesting presentation. I wondered if you could just comment on the political fallout, particularly in the UK, but also in France. I mean, the UK, Lloyd George was only newly Prime Minister. He'd promoted Nivelle over British generals and supported him. What were the ramifications? Did it weaken his position apropos that the generals and other members of his government in the UK?
Well, I think you can move from France backwards to that one. I mean, the French government obviously collapses, and then by the end of 17, you've got the Clemenceau kind of Pétain kind of duality there, kind of military civilian leader, and that's going to maintain till the end of the war. I think the situation, the collapse of another French government in the context of what's happening also in Russia, basically makes Lloyd George totally modify his views, and also the realization that he's backed the wrong horse in this. I mean, in the Hague Nivelle kind of like discussion, he's backed Nivelle, and that is the wrong horse, and it's very, very obviously so. And that will be covered in not only the French press but also the British press. So yeah, he has to rein in his horns hugely for the rest of the war.
Okay, thank you.
Right. Thank you, David. Okay, that's all we've got time for in terms of questions this evening. I'm sorry if we didn't quite get to your question, but thank you very much, everybody, for joining us. Above all, thank you, David, for a fascinating talk.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me on.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Okay. Well, good night, everybody. I hope you'll join us next time. Thank you.